That was bothering me. It's not symmetrical. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Happy early Thanksgiving. Today we do not have a special Thanksgiving message. We are moving right along in 1 Corinthians. So if you have not done so, please turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Originally, I wanted to go through the remaining part of the chapter, namely from verse 18 to verse 31. But as I was studying, I thought it would be better to stop at 25. So we will cover verse 18 to verse 25 today of 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Let me read and you can follow along. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. For Jews request a sign, and Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness. But to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than man, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Paul is continuing to elaborate upon something that he mentioned previously on verse 17. He said, For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of no effect. If you remember last week, Paul was dealing with a particular problem, namely the division of the church, the partisanship. Different people of the church found in Corinth. Again, we're not talking about people who gathered in one location and had a little plaque or a sign in their, neat little building. We're talking about gatherings that were within the confinements of that city, but essentially, Paul considered them all the church of Jesus Christ in Corinth, regardless of where they were geographically located within that region. And he noticed that these different groups of people, they tended to follow one leader or another and even kind of brag about it. They would say, oh, I'm Paul's clan. Oh, I'm Apollos group. Oh, I'm for Jesus, for this, or for that. Peter was also mentioned there. And the response to that issue was basically Paul saying, Jesus is not divided, neither should you be. And I thank God that I didn't do certain things to stimulate these divisions, such as baptizing a bunch of people, because that seemed to be part of the issue, part of the equation, where people said, oh, so-and-so baptized me, so now I am stuck with him or whoever for life. And then Paul went on to say that he thanked God that that's not what he was called to do. He was actually just called to preach the gospel and do so in a very simple and straightforward manner. Nothing having to do with elaborate arguments and theories and ideas. philosophies, if you will. Just preach the gospel of Christ with this central message of Christ being crucified. And his idea was, if I added anything to this, I would be taking away from this central truth, this pillar, this foundation of the gospel, which is Christ crucified. And now he is going to elaborate on this idea, this central idea and hope that we have, Christ crucified. So on the first few verses here, verse 18 to verse 20, I think we're just going to split this up into two major sections. So this initial section, Paul is basically going to establish what the root of the problem is. Previously, he mentioned what the fruit of the problem was. One of them. He's going to mention many others. He said, look, I hear there are many divisions in your group, in your church. That's a problem. But that's only the fruit. That is actually the consequence of something much deeper. The root is what we're going to discuss here. It's this idea of God's wisdom and God's ways versus the world's wisdom and the world's ways. Paul here, he is exemplifying God's wisdom as the message of Christ being crucified, and the world's wisdom as human rationale, mostly as to how a human being can be elevated. And these two ideas, they are as far apart as it can get. There's actually an abyss between both of these ideas. And you have to choose one or the other. It's impossible for you to stay in a middle ground, because one group thinks something is foolish, and that very same thing is thought of as wisdom for the other group, and vice versa. So he is saying, look, you have to pick. There is no middle ground. There is this group and that group. Either you choose to be associated with the wisdom of God, typified by Christ being crucified, or you're going to rely upon human rationale, all of these philosophies, all of these ideas, and all of these theories that go around. You have to make a choice. For example, a couple weeks ago, as you know, I attended a football game with my lovely wife. She is actually the one that purchased or chose the seats. We went to SoFi Stadium. If you have not been there, it's a great stadium. It's only a few years old, so it's very high-end and high-tech. And truly, there are no bad seats, even though we were, pretty far up there. And when she told me about the seats and why she chose those particular seats, other than, the budgetary limitations, she mentioned, well, I made sure that I picked some seats on the 49ers side. And then I replied by saying, it doesn't really matter. They say on Ticketmaster or wherever she purchased it that there is a Rams side and a 49ers side, just because that's where the bench is. One side or the other. But the actual seats that fans can choose to watch a game, it can be anywhere. But her mentality is a South American soccer mentality. When you go to, especially a game that there's a rivalry, but essentially any game, South American soccer, there's like a Berlin Wall, just splitting the stadium in half. You have to choose one side or the other. There is no neutral area. There is no intermingling. You cannot associate with the other side. It is one or the other. It is very distinct. They have separate entrances and separate exits. You have to stay divided and apart. You have to be careful. You cannot associate even colors. Just, imagine if you want to just to kind of go new, you can even do that, because if the other team wears blue and you wear like a combination, or if they wear green actually, and you wear a combination of like yellow and blue, people will put two and two together and say, hey, wait a minute, yellow and blue, it turns into green, let's beat you up, right? It's that bad. Totally divided. Pick a side. No middle ground. No intermingling. Nothing in between. This vastness, this abyss between the wisdom of God and the wisdom of this world. For one, it's foolishness. For the other, it's wisdom. So this is the main idea that Paul is stating here in these first few verses. I'll read it again from verse 18 to verse 22. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For since the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believed. And then on verse 22, he starts to introduce different groups of people and how they relate to this particular truth, namely Christ crucified. On verse 22, he says, for the Jews request a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. And then Paul includes his motto, his maximum. What is his motto? But we preach Christ crucified. So this is the central idea. This is the main idea. We preach Christ crucified. Based on this central idea, based on this model, groupings of people are going to be positioned based on how they relate and react to this model. And he mentions three of them. He mentions the Jews, he mentions the Greeks, and he mentions the called. So initially, he says here on verse 23, after stating his motto, but we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block. Why? Why was Christ crucified, or we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews? The idea of a stumbling block, it's the idea of something scandalous. That's the word that we use for scandalous. It's the root of it is found in this particular term in the original. Basically, it's something that is so out there, something that is so defensive, or offensive, I should say, that it just kind of stumbles you. It trips you up. To the Jews, they were perfectly fine with a good part of that model. What's that model again? We preach Christ crucified. They agreed with we. They agreed with preach. They agreed with Christ. Christ basically means the Messiah. They preached the Messiah. They were expecting the Messiah. They were waiting for the Messiah. But once the crucifixion was added to that model, that's where it tripped them up. That's where the stumbling block came from, because they were very much preaching and expecting a Messiah, a Christ that was different than this one that was being introduced, that was being offered, that was being mentioned as the epitome of God's wisdom. Christ crucified. They were waiting for a Christ who was an honorable figure, who would relieve them from their social captivity. God, in his wisdom, he was offering a Savior. But much more so than the physical realm, from the social realm. He was offering someone to save them spiritually. To the Jews, they didn't feel like they needed spiritual salvation, much less from someone who would be crucified, die in such a dishonorable manner. Outrageous. Scandalous. Do not agree with it. Do not accept it. Not my cup of tea. So the Jews had an issue. They had an issue because they did not think that they needed that type of salvation. Again, they wanted to be liberated, but it was much more so from their temporal, social realm. Not so much internally, their hearts, their souls. But God knew better. He knew the necessity of men. The sin. The utter and complete, impure, and soiled nature of human beings. Incapable of cleansing themselves. The only thing that could do that was God dying. Imagine that. How filthy and utterly dirty and incapable of cleansing oneself can you be, that the only answer for that problem is for God to die. The Jews, their problem was not, again, expecting a Messiah. Their problem was not understanding who they were and how utterly soiled their soul was and in need of a complete cleansing from the inside out. It's sort of like babies. The other day, when somebody was discussing, it is disgusting, but they were discussing about newborn baby attires right around here. I think it was Mike and Leanne's baby, right? And they were talking about the onesies, right? That's the main attire of a baby, a onesie. And it took me a while after 3 kids. I think we figured it out after the fact. So if we had a 4th kid, it would have come in handy. But remember, everybody knows the onesies, right? And they engineer a special collar, right? So yeah, babies' heads are usually big, by nature. But so the opening of a onesie, it's pretty big. But they engineer little slats, little cuts here that fold over so you don't really notice it unless you need it. Why? When there's an explosion, that onesie should not be saved, should not be cleansed, you throw that thing away. But if you try to unclose your baby the conventional way, what is going to happen? Because the problem is down south, right? If you go up, as you usually do, when you take off a shirt, do you pull down? You go up. If you pull up the onesie, what is going to happen? You're going to spread that all over. So someone who was very wise, smart, they engineered this extra long opening so that you just peel it to the south and you throw that thing away. Get rid of it. It's useless. Soiled completely. Cannot be salvaged. Burn it. Acid. That's who we are. That's how we are. God needed to die. This was something outrageous for the Jews. They did not consider themselves that bad. I'm sure most understood. Not perfect. Work in progress. Could be better. But again, we're the chosen people. We're the elite. We're the special ones. Yeah, we want to be liberated, but we're already in a very good position. No, you're as bad as anyone else. There's no other hope for you other than Christ crucified. But I mentioned there are three groups. The second group, on the second part of verse 23, Paul mentions the Greeks, basically the Gentiles, but he specifies the Greeks, not only because he was in that region, but because the Greeks were thought of as the most educated, the smartest of the Gentile group, right? They were the most civilized. They're not barbarians by any means. And to them, he mentions that this central idea, this model, we preach Christ crucified. To them, it was thought of as foolishness. Now, part of that model they very much agreed with. They agree with we, and they agree with preach. They loved to preach. They loved to teach. They loved to listen. They loved to learn. They had many theories, many philosophies, many gods, many other ologies. That was their thing. So we preach all for that. Christ crucified, kind of foolish. Why? We have so many other options. We have so many better ways that we can reason as to how one human being, society in general, can be elevated. So many other ways. Christ crucified? That would not make our top 10, top 100, top whatever list. Paul even utilized this idea because they had so many gods and so many philosophies and so many ideas. When he was preaching in Athens, I mentioned this last week on chapter 17, he kind of utilized this idea of the unknown God. As Paul was traveling around and walking around, he noticed that there were several places and altars to worship different gods because, again, they had a plethora of gods. And even just to be safe, just to make sure that they did not miss a god, they would have an altar to the unknown God. And Paul utilized this idea by saying, look, this is the God that you do not know. This is the one that I want to introduce to you in a more intimate and complete way. And then he went on to preach the gospel. Was somewhat successful, but again, Paul didn't write a letter to the church in Athens. He eventually went on his way and stopped over in Corinth, and there he stayed for a much longer time. But all this to say, they had so many other options and so many other ways of thinking how a human being can be elevated. Christ being crucified compared to all other options, kind of foolish, kind of weak. They could think of so many other ways to have that happen. And in God's wisdom, the response to that basically is, not only is Christ crucified the best option, it's actually the only option. This is what is being stated here. I know you have many other options, and you think you're ranking them. And this, which I'm providing for you, the wisdom of God, embodied in Jesus Christ being crucified, you think that comparatively speaking, it's kind of on the bottom of the list. I'm here to tell you that not only is it the best option, it's actually the only option. There is nothing else. Again, the abyss. It's one or the other, nothing in between. But again, they didn't agree with that. So now from verse 24 to verse 25, Paul is going to introduce this third group. This third group of people who are aligning themselves with this model, with this main truth. On verse 24, he mentions, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. This third group is called the called group. Paul has used this term before in Romans chapter 8 and in other places. It's similar to the idea of election and the idea of God selecting a particular group of people to be saved, not because of their merit, but because of God's sovereign choice. And it is appropriate for Paul to use this terminology because, again, this group is not positioning themselves in the area of God's wisdom because they are better equipped than the other group. It's not because they are smarter. It's not because they are more intelligent. It's not because they've read more books. And it's not even because they are more religious. Why are they situated in this particular area, in this side of the abyss? Simply because of their calling. That is it, and that is all. Because they were called. And by calling, again, it doesn't mean just hearing the message. It's an effective call. It's something that you see the byproduct of that call. They heard, they understood, they believed. But it's all because of God and what God did on their behalf in selecting them for that blessed purpose. And for these who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Paul makes sure that they understand that this is not a select nationality. God is not making distinctions between ethnicities or how people look or how people think or how people are located within the world. God calls people from all groups, Jews and Gentiles or Greeks. And these who are called, they had the power and wisdom of God. Power. That which the Jews thought was a sign of weakness. Again, we're all for preaching Christ. Crucified, not so much, because that is not honorable. That is a sign of weakness. But to God and in God's wisdom, that is a sign of great power. And in a similar fashion, wisdom. That which the Greeks thought was foolishness actually is wisdom for those who are called. And then, more or less in a hypothetical way, just to drive down this point, Paul mentions on verse 25, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Hypothetically speaking, if you were to consider that which is the least wise aspect of God and the least strong, that would be infinitely wiser and stronger than anything anyone else can think of, put together, believe in. That's how far apart this is. That's how distinct these ideas are. And I mentioned in the beginning, what was the root of the problem? The root of the problem was centered around we preach Christ crucified. The reason why the church, the members of this particular church in Corinth, the reason why they were divided, they were trying to become better or thought of as better than the other groups of Christians in that city. It was because these worldly and human ideals were infiltrating the church. Paul basically is saying, you are straying away. You are actually leaning towards this other group. But again, there's this abyss, and it's incompatible. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot say that, yes, I believe in Christ crucified one day of the week, and the remaining days, you believe and you adhere to every other humanology and ideal and idea. It's incompatible. It's distinct. And the most interesting part, and we'll kind of close on this note, is this. Notice again, go back to verse 18. Let me read to you verse 18 once again. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. Now, depending on your translation, you might have a different way that this verb was used, but this is the appropriate way based on the original, perishing. And additionally, but to us who are being saved. Here, Paul did not mention those who have perished and those who are saved. Here, he is talking about somewhat of a continuing, progressive idea, which is kind of weird because we think of it as a done deal. Either you're saved or you're not saved. Either you have perished or either you are saved. But Paul here, he puts it in a progressive manner. Just think about the analogy, for the last time, I promise, of the abyss. And it's almost, now we're going to add to this analogy. And it's almost like we're here, we're in Antarctica, right? And there's the glacier. And because of, different things in the environment and so on and so forth, parts of that glacier, they just kind of break off the bigger piece. And if you're there, if you're a penguin, okay, in this analogy, you are a penguin, you're startled. And things start to crack and break and separate. And at first, it seems like you have a choice. You hop from one place to another. And initially, it's like, okay, that's a more stable piece. I'm going to be here. Oh, that piece has the most fish surrounding that. I'm going to be on that. This piece right here, it's farther away from the polar bears, so I'm going to be in this piece. And you're hopping back and forth. But what happens eventually? It starts flowing apart. And then what will happen if you try to make that one last leap to your doom? You will go. It's progressive. It's distancing itself. It's not compatible. It will not remain together. At first, it seems like, Paul is saying here, at first, it seems like you can live in both worlds. You can incorporate both types of wisdom. You are in an environment where it seems like all of these things are very wise and important and they make sense, but you are the church as well, so this makes sense. And initially, you're going back and forth, which is why you are experiencing all these problems. But you have to make a choice. You have to pick a side. There is no in between. There is no middle ground. If you are the called ones, you have the power and the wisdom of God, even if the rest of the world thinks that is foolishness, thinks that it's weakness. And our challenge is just that. We encounter problems almost on a daily basis. And the world has many ways to solve those problems. And often, those ways are completely incompatible to Christ crucified. Initially, it seems like we can hop back and forth, but eventually, if you do so, what you're doing is you're straying away. And the choice should be clear, even when it is tough. The wisdom of God, the power of God, Christ crucified. Amen.